Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to hour two of our virtual discussion on water quality throughout the Western Lake Erie Basin. We just had some good presentations on the science in the area from Mark Williams and Chris Winslow. We're going to move now into the economic impacts of these water quality challenges. What are the economic impacts for both rural and urban? As we define problems, then we start looking for solutions. And when we look for solutions, there's usually a price tag with that. So I want to thank you for taking time out. And I also want to give thanks to the Allen County, Indiana Soil and Water Conservation District for hosting this in their facility, the Nature Conservancy for their participation, the USDA NRCS for their science and their coordination with this as well, and also the Maumee Watershed Alliance, of which I am the vice president of, and I will be helping to moderate this series. So we're going to begin to do a little bit of a shift in thinking now, and that many of the challenges that are causing the impaired water quality have been known for a long time. And adoption to solutions sometimes is slow. And a question could be asked, why is this? And human behavior, it's a tough roadblock to overcome. And we're talking about change. We're talking about habits that need to be changed. And in addition, sometimes governmental and society is so large and slow moving that we recognize problems, but adopting solutions sometimes is a little bit of a challenge just because of that momentum that we have. There are best management practices that are out there, but sometimes we don't see the problems that come with them. And an example might be when we really first started looking in the 80s, and here's an urban guy talking about understanding agriculture, but no-till was a great way to reduce sediment loading and maybe some of the chemicals runoff. No-till was great, but it sort of created another problem. How do we get the nutrients applied to those crops at the right time? And so top dressing or broadcasting on top was used, and we begin to find that is creating some more of the runoff of the nutrient, losing some dollars right down the streams. So again, we're finding good solutions, and as we move along, maybe we find, okay, there might be something we need to adjust to that. And this is incorporating nutrients into the ground, but that comes at an expense. So starting off today with us will be Amy Cornell. She's with the Agribusiness Council of Indiana. She understands the ag retailers' financial challenges and farmers getting bigger and bigger. They'll contract out a lot of the work on their farms because we're talking about thousands of acres. And maybe a farmer just expects the ag retailers to have all that fancy, expensive equipment. And how do we balance the best management practices with that financial burden? And then Amy will be followed up by Jamie Bultemeier, who actually farms. And Jamie, I'm going to expect you to introduce yourself a little bit more when you come on because you've got a broader background than that. But we'll start with Amy, sharing the perspective from the Agribusiness Council of Indiana. Welcome, Amy.
Great, Greg, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to speak with you today. We are excited to talk about nutrient management and 4Rs here in Indiana. In November of 2020, Agribusiness Council of Indiana launched a voluntary certification program for ag retailers. And what this program does is it allows ag retailers to have an independent third-party audit come in and verify that they are utilizing the 4R best management practices, which I know you guys are familiar with, but just a quick recap: it's the right source of fertilizer, at the right rate, in the right time, and in the right place. And so, as Greg mentioned, there's a lot of work that ag retailers are already doing, right, in this space. But we also know that there's always going to be improvements to be made. And, how can we partner alongside with our ag retail members and encourage them to come alongside and, if they're not utilizing some of these practices now, adopt them. But also knowing that at the end of the day, when it comes to farm ground, the ag retailer is not the ultimate decision maker. It's the farmer. right? Ag retailers are the trusted advisors. They are looking to our memberships to our members, for recommendations, for advice. But at the end of the day, the farmer is going to be the one to choose. So the beauty of this program is that it's giving the ag retailers credit for the work that they're already doing. It allows space for them to continue through progression of the program, even in instances where they are not able to convince their farmer customers on certain recommendations or practices, right? Because they're able to document that they've educated their farmer customer, and then still continue to move on. And so it's just a really great program. And we looked at, what our surrounding states were doing. Ohio was one of the first geographies to start this off. Minnesota, Missouri, Canada, Florida, New York, and Northeast US all have various stages for our programs and in different parts of development. We currently have 4 certified locations here in Indiana, and they represent 111,000 certified acres. And you have a few up in your area. So the Andersons and Helena, up there, 2 locations, Waterloo and Bern, and the Northeast area of the state are both certified locations. So let's talk through a little bit more about what are some of the things, what are the standards that we're looking to incentivize folks to adopt. So for example, there are requirements within the program for locations that want to be certified to maintain soil samples, right? A certain amount of soil sampling within a specified amount of time. That applications to frozen and snow-covered ground are discouraged, but if it happens, that certain parameters are taken into account, including increased setbacks and reduced rates, similar to what happens with our livestock friends under the confined feeding permits that we have here in Indiana. So let me see if I can pull up this standard here. Will I have the ability to share my screen, Greg?
Yes, you do.
Okay, great. Just gonna get this pulled up. One second. Do you know how when you're doing a presentation and I minimized it to check something else and then I clicked the wrong button? Okay. Okay, great. Can you guys see this?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. All right. So this is a lot of narrative at the top, but I'm going to get right into the heart of it because I think this is where you will have the most interest. So the way the program is designed is that there's a requirement. It sets forth the evidence that's needed. So for example, the first one is that in any nutrient stewardship providers have undergone some initial training and staff is able to demonstrate that they know what the 4 R's are. And so there's evidence that's set out for each one. For each standard, there's 31. There is a percentage of acres that must meet the standard in order for the location to be certified. Also, the program is built to what type of service the ag retailer is providing. If they're a full service provider, so they're making the recommendations and they're applying it. If they're just making the nutrient management recommendations, or if they're just applying, right? So if I have 100 acres and I come in and say, I want 10, 10, 10, right? And I'm not asking for any recommendation. It's my land, it's my decision, that's what I want. Those retailers are only held to the applicator standard. And then in the audit year, it shows what year you must be meeting these standards in order to be certified and continue through the program. So it's a 3-year program. It's progressive. So year 1, you have to meet all the standards for year 1. Then when it comes up for year 2, it's all the standards for year 1 and year 2, and then year 3 and so on. So let me just scroll down here to show you some of the other things that are needed. So for example, is it requirement number 6 here is talking about making sure that you have all the adequate records that you need to make sure that you are applying things in the right place. So your field boundary, that you have the records of the soil tests, that you're tracking the crop year goals, and then what type of evidence is required. And then you can see here that for the percentage of acres for the first year, 75% of all of the acres that would fall under this standard must be met in order to continue to move through the program. So I know that's a lot of information all at once. And Greg, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to pause here and be able to answer any questions that folks might have.
Amy, that's good information. I'd like to share this quickly. One of our last presenters was talking about implementing some of the solutions, and he used the word anonymity as we look at maybe putting some practices on fields. As a ag retailer is working with a particular producer, does that information stay in-house? Is there any sensitivity on the part of a producer that's being counseled by an ag retailer, like I'll work with you on this, and okay, I guess I fail on this item and that item, but they're hesitant on how much that's shared? What sort of security are we providing out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the list that that the retailers are using, that does not have to be individually identified. Acres can be identified, with just a numbering sequence, so that we're not disclosing necessarily individual farm information. Also, our independent auditors are held to a very strict confidentiality agreement. And there's further confidentiality because, all of these ag retailers are competitors, right? And so they want to make sure that their secret sauce, what they think sets them apart from competitors stays in-house. And so another way that we're able to achieve that through this program is that the certification body, the Nutrient Stewardship Council, oversees the program. The certification body that actually goes through the results of the audit to make a recommendation about whether or not a location should be certified is not made up of any individuals employed by an agribusiness. So Ben Wicker, the Executive Director of Indiana Ag Nutrient Alliance, I serve on there, some folks from Purdue. And so that way we're able to objectively look at the information, but maintain confidentiality, not only for the farmer, but also for the retailers who are participating. But sorry.
Very good, Amy. I think that makes a lot of sense, because ultimately what we're after is some statistical data that we can measure up against some practices that are recommending and see if we're getting the results. If you're available to stay around for a little bit more, I'd like to bring Jamie Bultemeier on, who is a farmer. Jamie, please share a little bit more of your credentials. I know it's more than that. And so then in about 15 minutes or half past the hour, then we'll wrap up the rural piece. We'll be able to take some questions at that point in time, and then we'll jump into the impacts in the urban sector. So Jamie, please give the listeners a little bit more information about yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And yeah, I am a little bit different position than maybe some of the folks that you'll talk to in the production realm. I wear a couple different hats. So as a professional, I am an agronomist with A&L Great Lakes Laboratories, which is a soils and tissue laboratory, manure. We do analysis for all agricultural commodities and inputs. And we focused predominantly on doing the analysis of soils in order to provide farmers and crop consultants, ag retailers with the background data to build nutrient management plans. Along that lines of my profession, I'm also a certified crop advisor, But I want to spend most of my time here, Dan, today talking about my greatest passion, and that is being a farmer directly. And I want to talk a little bit about the process that a farmer goes through in adopting conservation practices. We all may start a little bit differently, but you'll find that once the ball is rolling, once the process is started, the story becomes very similar. A lot of times we, as producers, we try something new. We try something that we believe to be profitable, something that is conservation minded, and we have success. And then we try another thing, and we try another thing, and that ball keeps rolling. And sometimes we run into some hurdles. And that's what I want to share with you a little bit today, Dan, is just how that process got started for my family farm here, for my wife, Tracy, and I, and some of those hurdles. Then I want to switch out at the very end and talk just briefly from a professional standpoint of what's going on. And it's interesting, some of the things I chose to share fall right in place with what Mark, Chris, and Amy were already talking about, because all those aspects impact me as a producer. So I'm going to jump out here, and I want to give you just a little bit of background about the farm, just to sort of set the stage. And so this is a family farm operation. My wife and I operate it with our 2 young sons. It is very much a partnership. My wife and I both are professionals in the industry. We both have advanced degrees. We're both certified crop advisors. We are active in different boards. For example, my wife is the chair-elect for the International Certified Crop Advisor Board. And so we see a lot of value in this knowledge segment, but sometimes you find a disconnect between the professional side and the farmer. My wife, Tracy, complains from time to time. She says, I'm tired of dealing with farmers. Now I got to come home and talk to another one. You work, when you're on that land, when you're making those decisions for farming, it changes the way you look at things a little bit, even more so than the professional. So sometimes I have to balance those 2 sides. But what's sort of unique about our operation is we are a first generation, we're non-legacy. We're just getting ready to plant our 9th crop. So we're fairly new to this, but that also afforded us some really unique opportunities. Our very first conservation-minded decision was based on profitability. It was not based on conservation. And you'll see that as I share a couple of situations where the financial aspect is actually a stronger motivator than the conservation. But as you see successes from these, that conservation piece comes into play as an equal in that decision-making process to the profitability. And I don't want it to sound bad that we're here for profits only, but profit is important, because if we don't operate our farm as a business and generate a profit, we won't be in business next year. There won't be a 10th cropping season or an 11th if we don't watch our financials in the 9th one here in front of us. But what you'll find in a lot of cases is a good financial decision also makes good conservation as well. And that's what sort of gets people started and gets producers started down this road. And so I want to get into this concept a little bit of what we're doing here on our farm. But I want to start with this very simplistic concept as we look at nutrient loading of surface waters. And I'm going to dive right into the St. Mary's River because it has a huge impact on our farming operation. The biggest thing we're looking at when I'm managing my farm for a profit position is I want to increase my nutrient use efficiency. And I know that sounds like a really high-end fancy term, but it comes down to is I want to get the greatest return on my investment. For every dollar I spend on fertilizer, I want to get production back. I want to have some kind of recourse or something growth in my farm. So when I apply fertilizer, I'm doing it for one of 2 reasons. One, to feed the crop to get better or increase, maximize yields. And I want to fertilize to improve soil where they need it. So I think Chris did a really good concept of talking about some of these legacy issues. As you look at our farm, we do grid soil sampling. We pull soil samples on 2-acre grids. And so we take a large field, cut it into smaller pieces. And you'll find that I would argue with Chris that some of the hot spots that we have are smaller than 30, 40 acres. I have hot spots that are 4 acres. I don't apply fertilizer there. They're also usually my lower yielding areas because the crops have not removed the nutrient. The fertility has remained high. Usually my really good producing areas, the crops grow well, they remove nutrients from the soil, and that leaves with the grain or the forages from the field. And those areas need more fertilizer. So I'm trying to figure out how do I put the fertilizer where it's needed to get the best benefit. That's what I mean by nutrient use efficiency. But that also goes hand in hand with nutrient loss. If I'm losing 10, 20, 30%, whatever that number may be, if I'm losing that much fertilizer, I've got to find a way to stop it, because fertilizer is the largest variable input I have every year. So if I'm losing 20 to 30% of my investment, I've got to find a way to stop it, or I won't be in business next year. And what I'm finding on the farm is little changes can have huge impacts. But as you go down this conservation road, once you take those low-hanging fruit and make those changes, you run into hurdles. And we'll talk about that as we go along here a little bit. So I want to give you some background and sort of see how you fit in, how the farm fits in. So this is the Upper Maumee River watershed and the supporting watersheds around it. I want to dial right into where the farming operation is. So you see that H there on the screen, that is the home farm. And that's where I'm sitting right now in the kitchen. And that is on Wayne Trace. So that's where Wayne Trace Farms comes from. That particular farm was the first one we bought. That's where we got started in 2012. And that's one that we've always had in the back of our mind that is going to have conservation challenges because it has a direct water link to the St. Mary's. The southern property of this farm is the Jacob Collinger Ditch. The Jacob Collinger Ditch flows straight to the St. Mary's. So there's no safety net per se. If I lose nutrients from my field, it's straight to the ditch and straight to the St. Mary's. So I have a bit of an, I hate to say a moral obligation, but I feel responsible to make sure that I do what I can to stop that direct source, because there's no second chance downstream. But the farm I really want to focus on is where the X is. And this is the one that has really been one of our greatest challenges and the most rewarding. If you notice that X, that's on Highway 27, just off Highway 27, about 2.5 miles north of 469. So it's actually inside the loop around Fort Wayne. But if you also notice, it's about 2 miles direct line of sight from that northern bend in the St. Mary's River. And so while the home farm has a challenge and direct link to water, this one is one of our greatest opportunities and challenges simultaneously. So this is the farm. And if you notice, this is a picture from 2003. And you'll notice some flooding events, and we'll get into the reason and why and how that's come into play. But what really makes this farm unique is the drainage ditch that bisects it, runs through the middle. This is the Paul Trier ditch. And what's really unique about the Paul Trier ditch is it flows both directions. I know that sounds a little impractical or impossible, but it does. Under normal rainfall events, the water falls on the soil surface and its surface or tile drains to the Paul Trier ditch, and then it flows southward that 2 miles to the St. Mary's River. However, when the St. Mary's River reaches flood stage, the Paul Trier ditch flows north, and it brings that flood water back into this farm. And so this picture is from 2003, and I put a yellow box in there. I want to give you a sense of scale. That is a city block in downtown Fort Wayne. That is a tracing of the city block in which the Allen County Courthouse sits in. So if you look at this picture about 2 miles north of the river, we basically flooded equivalent to the downtown portion of Fort Wayne. Now, what was interesting is this is only happening once every 10 years or so historically. If you go through historical aerial images, you'll find that roughly every 8 to 10 years it floods like this. But it's interesting when I hear about Mark Williams' comment about how the flow has greatly increased in the St. Mary's River just south of Fort Wayne. We've seen it. This farm flooded in 16, 17, 18, and slightly in 19. So we had a 4 to 5 years run of flooding. And so one would say, oh, you know, why farm this? But this is some of the most productive land we have, and I'd argue some of the most productive land in Southeast Allen County. Just phenomenal opportunity, but it is, because of this, it has direct resource links, and it is challenging. And so this farm is one that garners a lot of our management ideals, but it also has driven a lot of management throughout the entire farming operation. So we've looked to make some very simplistic things. And I don't want to get on the details. We've done quite a few things, but I want to put just one concept out there related to this flooding. So these floods occur late winter through early spring, sometime December through April. This is actually the remnants of the 2003 April flood. Before we had the farm, we did not start farming this one until 2015 was the first year we farmed it. But we have some choices. Traditional application of fertilizers go on this field either fall or spring. We have two choices. We can do it right after fall harvest or right before we plant in the spring. So it doesn't cost a lot to make that decision. It is a logistical challenge, but it doesn't cost anything. With this particular opportunity, if we put it on in the fall, we have a 1 in 10 or better chance with increased rainfall, maybe even 1 in 5 chance, the farm's going to flood. And if it floods, the nutrient can solubilize and or physically particulate move off this farm when those floodwaters recede. Or we can apply the nutrients in the spring after the risk of flooding greatly subsides and closer to the crop nutrient uptake. And so that is the decision we've made. We put it on in the spring. And so those kind of decisions don't have a great deal of financial impact, but they believe they have an impact from a water quality standpoint. We can reduce that risk of that nutrient moving to the St. Mary's River. So that decision is financial, but we look at the conservation benefits of it, and that part is now starting to come into play. Hey, we get better use efficiency of our fertilizer, and we can also reduce loading to the St. Mary's River. Let's do it. But not all of our decisions have been that way. Our first decision that we made conservation minded in our farming operation was what tillage system to use. So we had an opportunity to build our farm from scratch per se. And so when we got started, we had limited resources. So we looked at, okay, how do we put our cropping system together? We can either use tillage to incorporate fertilizer, control weeds, prepare a seedbed, or we can go no-till, or we plant straight into the soil as it is. In that decision, no-till is more management. It's tougher to do. There's greater risk of crop yield losses, but it took less equipment, it took less input, it took less capital. We did it from a financial standpoint. We were able to buy larger equipment, adopt more technology, because we didn't have to buy as many pieces to farm that way. But it had tremendous improvements in soil structure, in soil erosion prevention, and so on and so forth. And so that was our first conservation. It was completely economic. This decision is economic and conservation. And as growers see these opportunities and start making these decisions, that conservation aspect becomes a greater part of that decision-making process. But we're into a challenging point, and Chris sort of brought it up. We're at a stepping point in our farm. We've done the low-hanging fruit. We want to do subsurface application. We want to do some of these greater things that have additional impacts, but there's not enough financial room in the budget to do these things. We're looking at some significant costs in purchasing equipment that just isn't in the budget right now. We're coming off one of the most challenging economic times in current agriculture, and things are looking positive, and we're very strong financially, but there's not a lot of wiggle room to start making these large investments. So now we got to start justifying, if we make that large investment, how does that impact our bottom line? A lot of the things we're doing now are minor changes and may cost us a few dollars, but has water conservation benefits. Let's do it. But when we have to start laying out $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 for a piece of equipment that might be actually more expensive than our primary equipment, it's hard to justify that. And so I'm encouraged to hear what Chris had to say on how we manage that. But I do want to take a chance, a turn here and just look at it from a professional side real quickly. Chris brought up some good points. Chris Winslow brought up some good points where management practices have to fit the land in which they're in. And there are some great things that can be done through regulation that can have broad stroke impacts. But my concern is if those regulations become too restrictive, will I be able to make good management decisions for my farming operation? Will I still have the freedom to do what makes sense, like spreading in the spring versus the fall, or is somebody going to mandate that? The greatest concern I see is I look at states like Wisconsin that have put very tight regulatory restrictions on farmers. And as I work with those farmers on a professional level and those ag retailers, what's happening is they're spending more of their innovation trying to find ways to circumvent the regulation to do what's right for the farm than finding innovative ways to solve the core problem. And I'd argue that potentially that very tight regulation is detrimental. Things like the 4R, things like not spreading on frozen ground, which take those low-hanging fruits out of the way without being too restrictive or positive. But my always concern is, do we go down the road to Wisconsin and get to the point where it's actually detrimental to the long-term goal at hand? So I know that's a lot of things to pack in there, but I want to try to give a couple different perspectives. But I don't want the conversation to end here. I'll go ahead and take a few questions, Dan. But if anybody would like to reach out and see these practices in hand, have some direct conversation on what we're trying to do as a producer and what other producers are doing, reach out and let's have that conversation. My personal farm email is there at waynetracefarms@hotmail.com. You can find us on our website at waynetracefarms.com. Follow us on Facebook. If we can continue that conversation with any of the parties online, by all means, let's do so.
Jamie, thank you very much for that. That ending comment about the idea of innovation isn't to try to figure out how to get around the rules. I'm going to tie that into this next comment. And we did have a question come in that I think dealing with the facts is going to be critical. And I think that last statement that, that is a fact sometimes. At first, I'd never heard of it, but maybe someone is using that innovation to move around some mandates that are well-intentioned, but maybe not be placed correctly. For the urban listeners out there, and you identified your farm right along, you've got the fall through ditch separating it, and you've got an area in your field that's kind of a hot spot. How do you address that while you're covering the whole field? How do you apply nutrient where you need it, but don't apply it where you don't need it? Again, this may be more for our urban listeners so they understand what a producer does.
I have a great relationship with my ag retailer, and that's the first foremost way we get this accomplished. I've got a series of staff, I shouldn't call them staff, but of partners in my ag retailers, one that makes my farming operation possible. So what I do is I go in, so if you look at a particular farm, that was about 65 acres. So I'll break that down into 30 individual subfields, and I will take a sample out of each one of those subfields. And I use GPS to identify where that sample data is located, and I generate a spatial map. I just no different than a topography map or a watershed map. I create a map of where those soil tests are. Now, is it perfect? No, because we're only pulling samples every couple hundred of feet, but it's much better than one sample for 60 acres. And then we have some of the information, like Chris mentioned, where we know as an industry, if soil tests are above 35 to 40 parts per million, depending on your cropping system, phosphorus, we don't want to apply anymore. And there's no need agronomically to apply more. There's no yield benefits putting more on. And so we use technology that looks at that particular map. And when the fertilizer spreader is going across the field, it identifies this area should receive no fertilizer. And of course, it's a little more technical than that, but that's the fundamental. And the fertilizer spreader shuts off, and it does not spread fertilizer there. When it crosses that area into an area that needs that has been identified to need additional phosphorus, it turns back on. And where my ag retailer comes in is I do the sampling. I have tied to the lab, so I do my own sampling, but then I can work with my ag retailer to finalize that map, make sure they're comfortable that it fits within their 4R certification, and they go apply it. And I can trust that they're going to apply it correctly. And then I get feedback and digital feedback showing that it's done. It's actually becoming very simple to do in production agriculture today. And I would argue financially behooving if you're not trying it. Those areas don't need fertilizer. I can still raise a crop without applying anymore. It's a great financial opportunity.
Very good. Well, that answers that question. Another one has come in. And so, being a certified crop advisor, this question came in. Do you have an NRCS nutrient management plan? And maybe more so driving, not to get into your personal business, and I'm not sure what that all entails, is that enough? Does it meet all of your needs? So I guess the question is, here's a program, NRCS nutrient management plan. Does it check all the boxes? Too much or not enough?
In the nutrient management plan, yes, first of all, foremost, I do have it, Dan, and you'll find that I'm very open to my farming operation. I think that's one of the keys that's going to be valuable to my long-term sustainability as a farmer. But no, I do have a nutrient management plan, and that's part of that conservation journey. I was managing my nutritional program on the farm based on my professional experience, based on my education, but I wasn't documenting it. I wasn't using it as a long-term plan. Early in our farming career, we worked with our NRCS agent to develop it. And now it's something that I maintain on a regular basis. Just last Sunday, I finished Sunday morning before church, finished updating it for 2021 and what we're going to do. It keeps a written record of these decisions we've made and why we've made them. The only challenge with it is I can't approve it. I'm not qualified to actually approve the nutrient management plan. I actually have to go to one of my fellow agronomists that has the appropriate certifications to actually sign off on it from a regulatory standpoint, which is sort of ironic. But no, I do have one, and it forces me and my wife to think through what we're doing and give it conscious thought. It's not as much the product as the process where the value of a nutrient management plan is.
Very good, Jamie. That was very helpful in explaining that. I think we're going to begin to shift on to the urban look at this. I want to again thank Amy Cornell, Agribusiness Council of Indiana, for joining us this morning, and then Jamie for taking us not only with boots on the ground and probably mud in the cleats to the professional side and how you view farming. Thank you very much. Appreciate both of you participating with us this morning. Would like to move now to what are the economic impacts on the urban side. And Adam, I don't know if you recently got this text message, but we have two municipal drinking water treatment plant operators that were going to join us. Adam McDowell is in the city of Defiance, and his cohort here, Jason Anspaugh in the city of Fort Wayne, just got called away because he's got a chemical problem that he's got to step away and manage the city's potable water. So Adam, you've got a little bit more time to stretch out here, but I think that the challenges that they view are probably similar, but just as Chris Winslow said to begin with, and Jamie reinforced a little bit, you know, cropland is cropland, but within a field, there are unique elements within each of those fields that you need to test, sample, and find. And I'm certain that there are some differences between the city of Defiance and Fort Wayne, but there's probably a lot of similarities there. I know that Adam is probably going to touch on this a little bit, but just for people to understand, a financial burden on municipalities and water treatment plant operators could be basically summed up this way. All the infrastructure is still in the ground. The pipes are there, the pump is there, the treatment facilities. But as we've gone through the last decade or two or three, people are more mindful, they're more conservation minded, they're using less water. Demographics of households have changed. We don't have as big of families in households, they're not using as much water. And of course, many of you have the new appliances, you can't get around them, low flow sink heads, low flow shower heads. And whether you have an efficient toilet or you put a couple bricks in the tank to use less water, I'm not sure. But the challenge now in municipalities is they still have the same infrastructure to maintain, and they're selling less water because of the positive benefit of being conservation minded, but it puts an extra burden on them. So Adam, if you would explain a little bit your range of history with Defiance, and then share with us some of the economic impacts that you're seeing as a municipal plant operator.
Okay, sounds good. Understand with Jason that that's part of our business. You know, just if I start rambling, forgive me. We had a main break last night at 2:30 in the morning. So I haven't slept much, so I'm a little spacey myself. I'm living on caffeine right now. Let me share my screen here. Defiance has got a little different situation. And, you know, we're going to kind of talk about our approach and how some of the things that we've dealt with. But first and foremost, you know, my name is Adam McDowell. I've been the water treatment plant superintendent here for the last 10 years. Worked for the city of Defiance for all of my adult life, 30 years. And since I'm only, you know, like 35, right? Then that means I started, anyways, I'm older than that. But I have been an employee of the city of Defiance for the last 30 years. I hold a class 4 water license in Ohio and a class 1 wastewater license. I do actually operate a wastewater treatment plant as well. Our plant has a lagoon system to deal with its waste treatment residuals. So we have an MPDS permit, and we deal with that side of it as well. I showed a picture here I thought was kind of interesting. The Defiance water treatment plant, Defiance bought it from a private company and built a state-of-the-art plant in 1921. So this is basically our 100-year anniversary of treating potable water. Prior to that, it was water supplied in the system that was not drinkable. And at that point in time, the Ohio Health Department required us to do that. But that's a picture of 1922 cutting edge technology. So we've been treating this water, the Maumee, for a long time. We have a lot of history with it. It's a very crazy water source. We're water rich here. We have lots and lots of water, but it's a very problematic source. So what Dan had mentioned about the cost of treatment, that actually factors in because we have all the water in the world to treat. We almost have an unlimited supply as opposed to people out west. but the difference is it's actually fairly expensive to treat. So that it does affect our citizens a lot. One of the things that's different about us is while everybody focuses on nitrate and phosphorus, and we also do as well, and we pay attention to those, and those are a factor, but Defiance deals with a third nutrient that's a lot of people don't seem to have on their radar, and that's ammonia. And I want to thank Bruce Cleland for making this. I know he's on with us today. This is part of a presentation that he did, but it just shows this is just 2020, just a one summer scope for it. But you can see the yellow marks on this are ammonia. And you know, the baseline that he puts is 0.2 milligrams a liter, which is what we consider problematic. I will tell you that over the last 10 years, we've had events where we've had ammonia measured in the river as high as almost 3 milligrams a liter, not 0.3, 3 milligrams a liter. They're also fairly random. They do typically coincide with rain events, but they don't always coincide with rain events. Sometimes we see ammonia spikes that are fairly unexpected, and they can happen at any given time. So we actually test for ammonia anytime we're pushing water to the reservoir every shift. So we have to shut our pumps that fill the reservoir down as soon as we see a spike in ammonia because of the impact that it has for us. Now, typically we trace that back, or we consider that a result of animal feed operations, but also very commonly the commercially applied nitrogen fertilizers are actually ammonia sulfate. And if there's through a process, I know most of you guys are actually way more knowledgeable about this than I am, but through a process of nitrification, that ammonia sulfate is turned into nitrogen in the fields. So the thing is that sometimes that doesn't work the way it appears like it should in the fields, and I think we end up getting spikes of ammonia that are basically just unprocessed. So, and that kind of ties back to what Mark had talked about, rain patterns, I think, and you know how fast that conversion process or the nitrification process happens in the field. I'm not a biochemist, but I do know that process a little bit. I actually ran an aquaponics system in my house for 3 years and learned a lot about that nitrification because that's the whole process behind it. Ammonia, and again, I know this is off the radar for a lot of you, and I beat this ammonia drum for the last 10 years with the state agencies. We pulled a lot of data, but ammonia has some real negative effects for us. And ammonia can cause extremely fast algal blooms. Ammonia has the ability to be taken up by algae cells quicker than nitrates because they don't have to be converted. It's almost like feeding them sugar. We see algal blooms whenever we have high ammonias that can sometimes double in a day. And we've seen cell counts that in the river or in the reservoir, both that have just went just to an unbelievable level very quick when ammonia levels are high. We've had toxic blooms in the reservoir in 2016 and 2019. And typically we don't see toxic blooms, but we do see blooms very, very frequently. And because of those blooms, though, we end up having the possibility of creating 2-MIB or creating geosmin and creating taste and odor events. And now for those, they may be created every couple of years, we go into a substantial event, but the problem we have with them is sometimes they can last months when they're in the reservoir, and they can be very excessive, and they can cost us business. They can really give us a negative image. But ammonia also has the ability to create nutrient cycling, because as the cyanobacteria dies, it actually releases ammonia. So it consumes ammonia, then it releases ammonia. So it turns around and just cycles that back through. So we actually have ammonia levels that increase in the reservoir as blooms decrease sometimes, and that can affect disinfection. But those sizable blooms increase organic loading overall and through the plant, and then that increases our disinfection byproducts. So one thing leads to another, leads to another. In the river, we see toxic blooms as well. Chris talked about the the Toledo blooms, and he talked about 2016 being really good. Well, 2016 being really good in Lake Erie had at least a little bit to do with the weather, because 2016 in our portion of the Maumee was the worst year we've ever had. With the dams that hold some of that water back, it creates an odd condition up here if we have a very dry spring. And just about every time that we've had a dry spring, we end up with a very, very bad year in the river. And a lot of times Lake Erie ends up with a really good year. So 2016, we had an algae event or an algal toxin event here in the Maumee in Defiance that had an algal toxin count of almost 20 part per billion. So we had a no contact advisory. Something we'd never really noticed. Actually, we don't know if we've ever had one. We just never measured it before. But we actually had two blooms that year. One was Planktothrix, which is what we see most times in the river. But we also had a Euglena bloom later in the year. So we actually had two very substantial algal blooms in the river in 2016. So it was a terrible year for the Maumee. But like I said, ammonia, typically it's converting to nitrates or converting to nitrates through nitrification. So as our downstream counterparts, Napoleon, Bowling Green, they typically don't see the ammonia that we see, but they see higher nitrates. Our nitrates levels overall have dropped in the last several years, but our ammonia levels seem to be increasing. So I think we're seeing less of that nitrification happening in the river itself. And obviously ammonia can be toxic to fish, but all this still ends up in Lake Erie and causes blooms. Typically in our industry, there's been some studies done, and I was looking for some good information. I couldn't find any that I thought was conclusive and solid enough to include numbers wise, but treating the nutrient loading problem in the fields or at the sources is much, much cheaper than it is to treat at the treatment plants. And I know that people would argue that maybe, but just to kind of give you something to go with that, Defiance had to install a new treatment plant because of changing requirements. Back in 98 to 2000 was that construction. It costed about $17 million. In 2008, we constructed a 74-acre reservoir, which was about $7 million. That was specifically because of nitrates. We had nitrate excursions, and then the EPA required us to put into findings to make that reservoir. But that helped in some ways, and it created a breeding ground for algae. We deal with taste and odor problems and algal blooms now that we never dealt with before. Not to mention the cost of treatment of that reservoir for algicides is substantial. But on top of that, we're currently under construction for a granular activated carbon system, which is a price tag of about $9.5 million. So, when you combine these together, you end up with about $33 million over the last, 22, 23 years, all because of regulatory requirements, but all tied to that source quality in the river. The GAC project is an algal toxin barrier, as well as required for us to meet disinfection byproducts. Now, again, that's also part of the organic loading. So this breaks down to about $2,000 for each resident in the city of Defiance, not in operational costs. Those have climbed significantly, but this is just in capital. So, when you start looking at numbers like this, they're very substantial, but what you have to understand is how many plants down the river are dealing with the exact same problem. Bowling Green, Napoleon, those plants all pull from the river as well, whether they use a reservoir or not. So these costs aren't like, oh, it costs $33 million to fix it. No, that's a starting point spread out with probably 10 other plants, not to mention Toledo's situation. These problems are compounded into the hundreds of millions of dollars just to treat with the nutrient, just to solve the nutrient issues and make the water potable again. It's so much cheaper to deal with it at the waterway than it is to try to treat it out afterwards. So, I mean, that's kind of what we're focused on. That is kind of all that I was planning. I was planning a shorter talk, and I'm hoping that there's some thoughts and that we can bounce around with this. But I want to include this picture. This was the Maumee River. This was taken. I get a chance to look at this river every single day, for good and bad. But this was July 27, 2016. And this was right off of our intake. And this was during our Plankothrix bloom, which is the toxic bloom that had the contact advisory. Believe it or not, the Euglena bloom that happened later looked way worse than this. But it was not toxic, so it didn't make as much concern. But that, with that, I'll take any questions.
Adam, thank you very much. Appreciate that. I do have one question that's come in, and you know, I don't know if this is outside your wheelhouse, but you just mentioned that, you know, it is probably much more cost efficient to see if we can get to the water quality issues in the Maumee River before they get to a treatment plant and you have to take them out. You know, the old adage of stitch in time saves nine. What is the city of Defiance? What is Defiance County, you in particular? What are some of these practices that you think might be beneficial to the burden you have in making potable water that would ease that a little bit? What's out there that might be a solution to treat it before it comes to your plant?
I think that, you know, as people have mentioned already, I think subsurface application of fertilizer is going to have to be a necessity. It's not, you know, and I'm the same way with the other speakers. It's not there's no one to blame in this necessarily. It's not a blame issue. Crop producers have to produce more crops. If you look at fertilizer use, I had pulled up on when Dan and I were on the phone the other day. You look at fertilizer use in the U.S. from 1920 to now, it's on an order of magnitude greater. But it's necessary. It's not that we should just stop fertilizing. That's anybody who thinks that's insane. But we are going to have to come to the understanding that in our soil types, and my portion of the Upper Maumee, and I don't know what it is farther over into the Fort Wayne area, but our area is almost all heavy clays. And the rain events that we're seeing and the way we've been tracking weather as well, because we're a National Weather Service station, we see while the daily rainfalls are higher, it's the hourly rainfalls that are by far worse. You may have you don't see very many rainy days all day, but what you see is a 2-hour period where you might get 3 inches of rain or 2 inches of rain in an hour or two. And it appears as what we're doing is we're running fertilizer and we're running things off the fields in their raw form before they have a chance to nitrify. And what that's doing is causing us significant problems here. And I think that's where we're going to have to put our focus is keeping that stuff in the fields, and possibly even you know, more naturalization projects to keep water or to keep some of the wetlands, to build wetlands to take some of that runoff before it gets to the river. But I think we're going to have to bank some of those nutrients.
All right, very good. And that, again, I just want to reiterate the science and the people with boots on the ground, they are all aware of what each other's doing. And I think collectively we'll keep coming up with these solutions and processes to work on improving the water quality. Well, we're coming up to our 5-minute break here. So I want to definitely thank you for taking a little extra time and spending with us, Adam, and also with Amy and Jamie for starting this off. And we'll take a 5-minute break. We'll come right back at 11. And then we're going to listen to some success stories. And again, we'll do the tag team. We'll listen to some success stories in the rural environment and some success stories in the urban environment. Again, thank you, everybody, for spending some time this morning. And thank you to the Allen County SWCD, the Nature Conservancy, USDA, NRCS, and of course, the Maumee Watershed Alliance. We'll see everybody back here at 11. Thank you.